One missile launched, radar locked it, interceptor fired, and then something happened in the sky above 7 million people that every Pentagon general, every missile defense engineer, every billion-dollar system was never built to stop. What they saw next, it looked like the sky was falling apart, and the most expensive defense shield in human history had already lost. Welcome back to Currency Archives, the channel that tells you what the news won't. Now, before we go any further, if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, think of it this way, my friend. You wouldn't leave the house in the morning without your morning chai, would you? Don't leave this channel without hitting that subscribe button. It takes 1 second, just like that missile did, before everything changed. And hey, we're a family here from all corners of this world. Drop in the comments below, where in the world are you watching us from today? Because what's coming next in this video affects every single one of you, no matter where you are. Let's get into it. On the night of March 6th, 2026, 7 million people in Israel looked up. What they saw in the sky above them was not what any general had prepared for. It was not what any defense engineer had designed against. And it was certainly not what the billions of dollars spent on missile defense systems were ever meant to face. They saw one missile become hundreds. For decades, the world's most powerful militaries operated on a simple assumption. A missile is launched, radar detects it, a tracking system locks onto it, an interceptor fires. One threat, one response. Clean, calculated, controlled. This was the foundation, the entire logic that modern missile defense was built upon. Governments spent hundreds of billions of dollars perfecting this equation, testing it, refining it, selling it to their citizens as a shield, a promise of protection that money could buy and technology could guarantee. America built the Patriot system on this logic. Israel built the Iron Dome on it. The Pentagon spent decades engineering layers of defense, each one designed around the same core assumption, that a missile is a single object, moving in a single direction, toward a single point. That assumption died on March 6th. Here is what actually happened. Told not with panic, but with precision. Iran launched what appeared to be a single missile. Radar systems detected it immediately. The tracking algorithms locked on. The trajectory was calculated within seconds. An interceptor was fired. The system performed exactly as designed. And then, at a precise altitude, chosen deliberately, the missile opened. From that single casing, hundreds of individual warheads released simultaneously. They spread outward across a wide area, like an umbrella opening midair, and continued falling toward the ground below. By the time the defense system processed what had just happened, the intercept window was already gone. The interceptor that had been fired hit the empty casing, a shell, a decoy, a ghost. The hundreds of submunitions were already falling, already spreading, already beyond the reach of any single response defense architecture ever built. To stop them at that point would have required hundreds of interceptors launched in the same second. Not sequentially, not in waves, simultaneously, in 1 second. No system on Earth is designed to do that. The videos that spread across the internet that night did not look like war footage. They looked like fireworks, bright trails spreading outward across the Israeli sky. A strange, almost beautiful pattern that millions of people watched without fully understanding what they were seeing. They were not watching a missile being intercepted. They were watching the moment one missile became hundreds. They were watching the moment a defense system, funded by generations of taxpayers, engineered by the finest military minds in the world, realized it had already lost. Now here is where this story stops being about missiles and starts being about something every serious businessman and entrepreneur must understand. What Iran did that night was not simply a military development. It was an economic disruption event. Consider the numbers with clear eyes. America's most advanced interceptor missiles cost between $3 million and $9 million each one. To attempt to neutralize a single cluster missile launch, trying to intercept the submunitions individually after separation, would require dozens of interceptors fired in the same moment. That translates to somewhere between $100 million and $300 million in defense expenditure to stop a single incoming strike. Iran's cluster missile costs a fraction of that. One side is spending millions to attack. The other side must spend hundreds of millions to defend. And Iran can launch dozens of these in a single night. This is not a military imbalance. This is an economic asymmetry, and economic asymmetries of this scale do not stay contained to the battlefield. The equation that modern missile defense was built on, one threat, one response, has been broken. What replaces it, and what that replacement costs the global economy, is what no financial headline is currently telling the business community. There's a business principle that every entrepreneur eventually learns, usually the hard way. It is not the strongest competitor that destroys an industry. It is the cheapest one, who makes the expensive one irrelevant. Blockbuster did not lose to a better video store. It lost to a company that made video stores unnecessary. Kodak did not lose to a better camera. It lost to a device that made film rolls pointless. Nokia did not lose to a better phone. It lost to a platform that made button keyboards obsolete. In every case, the disruption followed the same pattern. One side kept investing in perfecting an expensive system. The other side invented a cheaper way to make that expensive system worthless. What Iran just deployed over Israeli skies on March 6, 2026, is the military version of that exact principle, and the business community is not paying attention because they are still watching it as a war story. It is not a war story. It is a disruption story. To understand what Iran actually built, one must think less like a soldier and more like an economist. For decades, Western defense contractors operated inside a comfortable business model. Governments needed protection. Contractors built expensive systems to provide it. The more sophisticated the threat, the more sophisticated and expensive the solution. Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. These companies thrived inside a system where complexity meant profit, and every new threat justified a new multi-billion-dollar contract. The underlying assumption of this entire industry was simple. The attacker and the defender would always be competing on the same technological plane. If Iran built a faster missile, America would build a faster interceptor. If Iran built a more maneuverable warhead, America would build a smarter tracking system. It was an arms race, expensive on both sides, but manageable. Because both sides were playing the same game. Iran just changed the game entirely. Here is the architecture of what they built, explained not in military language, but in the language of competitive strategy. A cluster missile does not try to beat the interceptor. It does not try to fly faster or maneuver more aggressively. It does not compete with the defense system on the defense system's terms. Instead, it waits. It launches as a single object. It allows the radar to detect it. It allows the tracking system to lock on. It allows the interceptor to fire. It cooperates with every stage of the defense process, right up until the precise moment the defense system is fully committed. And then it transforms. At a calculated altitude, chosen specifically to fall inside the gap between detection and interception, the missile opens. Hundreds of individual warheads release simultaneously. The defense system's committed interceptor strikes an empty shell. And the warheads, now too numerous, too spread, and too low for any sequential response, continue to their targets. The cluster missile did not defeat the defense system by being better. It defeated it by making the defense system's entire investment irrelevant at the moment of truth. This is not military innovation. This is economic disruption applied to warfare. Now consider what this means for the balance sheets of nations. America currently maintains defense contracts worth hundreds of billions of dollars built around interceptor technology. The Patriot Advanced Capability System, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense, known as THAAD, the Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense System, each one engineered with extraordinary precision, each one priced accordingly. A single THAAD interceptor costs approximately $10 million. A Patriot PAC-3 interceptor costs around $4 million. These are not weapons of aggression, they are weapons of response. Their entire value proposition rests on one assumption, that they can reliably neutralize an incoming threat. Against a cluster missile launch, that assumption collapses. To attempt interception of submunitions after separation, a defender would need to fire dozens of interceptors in a single second. That is not a tactical problem. That is a procurement problem, a budget problem, an economic problem that no current defense spending model was designed to solve. Iran spent approximately $1 million per missile to make a $10 million interceptor fire at an empty shell. That is not a military victory. That is a margin play. And in the world of business, the side with the better margin always wins the longer war. There's a moment in every major economic shift that most people miss completely, not because they are not watching, but because they are watching the wrong thing. In 2008, most investors watched the housing market. They should have been watching the derivatives sitting underneath it. In 2020, most businesses watched the virus. They should have been watching the supply chains quietly fracturing behind it. In 2022, most analysts watched the Ukraine conflict. They should have been watching the European energy infrastructure being repriced in real time beneath it. History does not announce its turning points loudly. It whispers them through second-order consequences that only the most disciplined observers ever catch in time. Right now, the world is watching Iran's cluster missile as a military story. The turning point is not the missile. It is everything the missile just set into motion. Begin with the most immediate pressure point, one that every businessman, every entrepreneur, and every serious investor must understand before anything else: the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow stretch of water, just 21 miles wide at its most constrained point, is the single most economically consequential choke point on the planet. Approximately 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes through it every single day. That includes the majority of crude exports from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Iraq, and Iran itself. For decades, the West's ability to keep that strait open rested on one foundational guarantee: that American naval power in the region was overwhelming, credible, and effectively unchallenged. That guarantee just became significantly more complicated when Iran demonstrated on March 6th that a single cluster missile launch can overwhelm the most advanced point defense systems in the world. Every naval vessel currently operating in or near the Persian Gulf entered a different risk calculation, not a hypothetical risk, a documented, demonstrated, mathematically quantified risk. Insurance underwriters noticed within hours. Shipping executives noticed within hours. Energy traders noticed within hours. The business community is still watching the missile footage. Here's what is actually moving beneath the surface, told with a precision that serious decision makers require. Global shipping insurance rates for vessels transiting the Persian Gulf corridor began repricing immediately following the March 6th demonstration. This is not speculation. This is standard actuarial response to a documented threat upgrade. When the risk profile of a transit route changes, the cost of insuring cargo through that route changes with it. Higher insurance costs mean higher shipping costs. Higher shipping costs mean higher delivered costs for every product that moves through or depends on Gulf energy supply chains. And in a globally integrated economy, that category of product includes nearly everything. Maersk, one of the world's largest shipping operators, had already suspended multiple routes, citing extreme military risk in the region. That suspension was not a precaution. It was a pricing signal. When the world's largest shipping companies begin rerouting away from a corridor, the cost of moving goods through that corridor does not gradually increase. It reprices overnight. Now follow the energy thread, because this is where the business consequences become impossible to ignore. Brent crude was already trading above $86 per barrel and accelerating at the time of writing. Qatar, one of the world's most critical liquefied natural gas exporters, had halted crude loading operations entirely. 20% of global oil supply was effectively trapped behind a choke point that American naval power could no longer guarantee with the same credibility it held 72 hours earlier. For entrepreneurs and business owners, this is not an abstract geopolitical development. This is an energy cost event. And energy cost events do not stay contained to fuel prices. They move through every layer of a modern economy with quiet, systematic precision. Manufacturing costs rise. Logistics costs rise. Agricultural costs rise because modern farming runs on diesel and fertilizer, both petroleum derivatives. Consumer prices rise, and central banks, already navigating a fragile inflation environment, face a policy contradiction they have no clean answer for. Raise rates to fight inflation and risk cracking an already stressed credit market. Hold rates and watch purchasing power erode further across every major economy. There is no comfortable exit from that position. But here's the development that the financial press has almost entirely failed to cover, and it is arguably the most consequential of all. China's two largest state energy companies, Sinopec and PetroChina, had quietly issued an emergency internal directive in the days preceding the March 6th missile demonstration. The directive suspended all diesel and gasoline exports from China's strategic reserves. Not reduced, suspended. China was not reacting to the missile strike. China was anticipating what the missile strike would confirm. They were hoarding energy supply ahead of a Hormuz disruption scenario that their intelligence apparatus had apparently assessed as not merely possible, but probable. When the world's largest energy consumer begins hoarding fuel in silence, the cost floor for global energy does not drift higher. It gets restructured from the ground up. This is the chain reaction that no financial headline is currently pricing into its models. A single missile demonstration that broke the interceptor equation triggered an insurance repricing event that is feeding into a shipping cost restructuring that is layering onto an energy supply disruption that China was already positioning against in silence. While Western markets were still debating whether the conflict would escalate, it has already escalated, not on the battlefield alone. In the spreadsheets of every major shipping company, energy trader, insurance underwriter, and sovereign wealth fund that understands what a broken defense equation actually costs when the bill finally arrives. There's a particular kind of businessman that history remembers, not the one who predicted the crisis loudest, not the one who panicked first, not the one who appeared on television explaining what just happened after it already happened. History remembers the one who read the signal quietly, while everyone else was still arguing about the noise. John D. Rockefeller did not build Standard Oil during stable times. He built it during the chaos following the Civil War, when energy supply lines were uncertain and everyone else was too frightened to move with conviction. Andrew Carnegie did not acquire steel mills during prosperity. He acquired them during the Panic of 1873, when distressed assets were available at fractions of their actual value. The pattern repeats itself across every major economic disruption in recorded history. Serious decision makers do not wait for clarity. They act on pattern recognition before clarity arrives. And the pattern unfolding right now in the aftermath of Iran's cluster missile demonstration is one of the clearest asymmetric opportunity signals the global business environment has produced in years. Begin with what history documents, not what analysts are currently predicting. Every major weapons disruption in modern history has preceded a significant economic regime change. Not immediately, not dramatically, but systematically, and with remarkable consistency. When radar technology was introduced in the Second World War, it did not simply change aerial combat. It restructured the entire global aviation industry within a decade. When nuclear weapons established mutually assured destruction as the dominant strategic doctrine, it did not simply end conventional superpower warfare. It redirected trillions of dollars of capital into a Cold War economy that reshaped global manufacturing, aerospace, and technology sectors for 50 years. When precision-guided munitions emerged in the Gulf War of 1991, they did not simply make warfare more accurate. They made certain categories of military hardware permanently obsolete and triggered a complete restructuring of defense procurement budgets across every NATO member nation within 5 years. Iran's cluster missile demonstration follows the same historical logic. A defense architecture built on interceptor technology, costing hundreds of billions of dollars across multiple allied nations, has just been shown to contain a fundamental vulnerability that cannot be patched with software or resolved with additional training. It requires a complete rethinking of the system, and complete rethinkings of systems always redirect enormous flows of capital. Now consider where that capital is already beginning to move, because this is the intelligence that serious entrepreneurs and investors require above everything else. The first movement is in directed energy. Laser-based defense systems, technologies that fire concentrated beams of light rather than expensive interceptor missiles, suddenly become the only economically rational response to a cluster munition threat. A laser weapon does not cost $4 million per shot. Once built, each shot costs approximately $1 in electricity, against a weapon that releases hundreds of submunitions simultaneously. A system capable of rapid sequential engagement becomes not merely attractive, but strategically mandatory. Companies positioned in directed energy research and development are not currently priced for the contract volumes that a post-cluster missile defense restructuring will require. That gap between current pricing and future contract reality is where serious capital is beginning to quietly accumulate. The second movement is in electronic warfare and signal disruption. If a cluster missile's separation mechanism relies on altitude sensing technology or internal timing systems, then disrupting those systems before separation becomes the most economically efficient point of intervention. The defense industry term for this capability is electronic countermeasures. The business reality is simpler. It is a category of technology that just moved from useful to essential overnight. The third movement, and perhaps the most overlooked by the mainstream business community, is an energy infrastructure independence. Every major economy that currently depends on Gulf energy supply chains just received the clearest possible signal that dependency on that corridor carries a risk premium that was previously theoretical and is now demonstrated. The businesses and governments that act on that signal first will spend the next decade building the energy infrastructure alternatives that everyone else will be forced to buy from them later. This is not speculation. This is the same pattern that played out after the 1973 oil embargo, when the nations that invested immediately in alternative energy infrastructure and domestic production capability emerged a decade later with structural energy cost advantages that compounded quietly for 30 years. The entrepreneurs who understood that signal in 1973 built generational wealth from it. The ones who waited for clarity paid higher energy prices for the rest of their careers. Now bring this down to the level of the individual decision maker, because that is ultimately where every strategic analysis must land to have genuine value. The business community does not need to understand missile physics to act intelligently on what just happened. It needs to understand three things with absolute clarity. First, the cost of defending critical infrastructure just increased permanently across every geography that relies on American security guarantees. The cost will be passed through supply chains, insurance premiums, and energy prices over the next 12 to 36 months. Businesses that have not stress-tested their cost structures against a sustained 15 to 25% energy price increase are operating with a blind spot that the market will eventually price in for them, whether they are ready or not. Second, capital is already moving toward asymmetric defense technology, domestic energy production, and supply chain regionalization. These are not speculative themes. They are documented capital flow directions that follow logically and historically from the specific type of disruption that just occurred. The entrepreneurs who position along these flows early will find themselves running with the current rather than against it. Third, and most importantly, the window between a disruption signal and a disruption consensus is always the most valuable window for serious decision makers. Once the mainstream business press finishes explaining what Iran's cluster missile means for the global economy, the repositioning opportunity will have already closed. That window is open right now. History does not reward the loudest voice in the room during a crisis. It rewards the quietest mind. That read the signal correctly, while everyone else was still watching the footage of a missile, becoming hundreds in a sky above 7 million people who never saw it coming. The equation broke on March 6, 2026. The only question that remains for every entrepreneur, investor, and serious decision-maker watching this is whether they will act on what that broken equation actually means before the window closes. This has been Currency Archives, the channel that tells you what the news will not.